Canada's response isn't just about striking back for the sake of retaliation. It's about something far bigger. It's about changing the balance of power on the global stage. For years, the U.S. has been the dominant force in world trade. It's wielded its power through a complex web of alliances, economic influence, and military might. But now, Canada, traditionally seen as the quiet neighbor to the north, is forcing the U.S. to reckon with a new reality. The world isn't as predictable as it once seemed, and power isn't always where you think it is. The move to impose tariffs on specific U.S. goods, especially those with symbolic and strategic significance, isn't just a shot across the bow. It's a deliberate attempt to force Washington to recalibrate its view on global relations. By targeting key industries, Canada isn't just hitting the pocketbooks of U.S. companies, it's making sure that the political fallout is unavoidable. Bourbon, orange juice, and Tesla, they're not random products. They're strategically chosen to create maximum disruption and force politicians in Washington to listen. But beyond these calculated moves, Canada's broader strategy is to weaken the very foundation of U.S. economic power. The auto industry, with its sprawling supply chain stretching across North America, is the first battleground. The U.S. may think it can protect its workers by raising tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, but what they've failed to account for is the interconnectedness of the system. The parts manufactured in places like Detroit, Ontario, and Mexico are the lifeblood of U.S. car production. When those parts become more expensive or delayed because of tariffs, it creates a domino effect that impacts every aspect of the car manufacturing process. Higher prices on raw materials lead to higher costs for manufacturers, which get passed down to consumers in the form of more expensive cars. And as car prices rise, fewer consumers can afford to buy new vehicles. Factories that rely on a steady flow of demand slow down or close altogether. Workers in places like Ohio and Michigan, once secure in their jobs, are laid off as production halts. These are communities that live and breathe auto manufacturing. Their very survival depends on these factories staying open and running at full capacity. But when tariffs jack up the cost of doing business, those factories start closing. It's the workers, the everyday people of America, who end up paying the price. And make no mistake, these are the same people who were promised that tariffs would bring jobs back to the U.S. Instead, they're being left in the lurch. But Canada isn't just targeting U.S. industries that are vulnerable, it's also positioning itself as a rising economic power in its own right. As the U.S. scrambles to manage the fallout of its own tariffs, Canada is quietly, but strategically, building new trade alliances. This isn't just about surviving the immediate effects of the tariff battle. It's about playing the long game. Canada has already begun exploring new trade deals with countries like Europe and nations in Asia. By diversifying its trade relationships, Canada is reducing its reliance on the U.S. and opening up new markets for its goods. European companies are now looking to Canada as a more reliable partner. Even China, the economic powerhouse that the U.S. has long been at odds with, is offering Canadian companies new opportunities to bypass the U.S. entirely. And it's not just trade deals that Canada is strengthening. Canada is making moves to solidify its position in key industries that are essential to the global economy, especially in the tech and energy sectors. Canada's vast reserves of natural resources, especially in oil, gas, lithium, and nickel, are increasingly valuable as the world moves toward electric vehicles and renewable energy. The U.S. may have thought it could impose tariffs on Canadian goods without consequence, but now Canada holds one of the most valuable cards in the deck. If Canada decides to use its dominance in these raw materials as leverage, the consequences for the U.S. could be catastrophic. Imagine a situation where Canada stops exporting key materials like nickel and lithium to the U.S. These materials are essential for the production of electric vehicles, and their scarcity could drive up prices, slow production, and hurt the profitability of companies like Tesla, which is already facing increased competition from foreign automakers. Not only would this disrupt the U.S. auto industry, but it would also threaten one of the most important sectors in the U.S. economy, the tech industry. But Canada's potential weapon of influence doesn't just stop at raw materials. Energy is another area where the U.S. is vulnerable. Canada is one of the largest suppliers of oil, gas, and electricity to the U.S. If Canada were to cut off the energy supply, or even reduce it, prices in the US could skyrocket. Imagine gas prices doubling overnight, or power shortages hitting northern US states during winter. This isn't just an inconvenience. This is a matter of national security. It's not just about economic damage. It's about the US's ability to function. Energy isn't just something people rely on for their daily lives. It's the backbone of industry. And without stable energy supplies, entire sectors of the US economy would grind to a halt. If Canada pulls the plug on its energy exports, the US could be facing a crisis of monumental proportions. Gas prices would spike, inflation would spiral out of control, and entire industries could face production delays or shutdowns due to power shortages. It's important to remember, though, that Canada hasn't even had to play this card yet. The mere possibility that Canada could pull back its energy exports is enough to keep US officials awake at night. The US thought it was flexing its muscle with tariffs, but in doing so, they've created a volatile situation where Canada now holds the upper hand. And all of this doesn't even begin to touch on the larger global implications. As the US and Canada lock horns, the rest of the world is watching and reacting. Countries in Europe, which have long been tied to the US through trade agreements like the US-EU Trade Pact, are already starting to rethink their relationships with both the US and Canada. If the US can't be trusted to play by the rules, Europe may look to strengthen its ties with Canada or even strike deals that bypass the US altogether. Meanwhile, China, always looking for ways to expand its influence, is positioning itself as an alternative partner for Canada. Chinese companies are eager to establish trade routes with Canada, particularly in the tech and energy sectors. If Canada can successfully forge these new relationships, it could find itself in a much more powerful position globally. The US, meanwhile, could lose out on crucial trade deals, which could further erode its dominance in international markets. And it's not just the US and Canada that are feeling the heat. Developing countries that once relied on the US for trade are now looking to diversify. Countries in Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia are seeing an opportunity to step in and fill the void left by a US that's increasingly distracted by internal trade wars. These countries are seizing the chance to expand their markets and grow their economies at the expense of American influence. What does all this mean for the average person in the US? It's simple. The economic fallout from this trade war is going to be felt everywhere. In the short term, Americans are already starting to notice the impact in their daily lives. Prices are going up on everything from food to electronics to household goods. As supply chains buckle under the weight of tariffs, consumers will be forced to pay more for less. And as costs continue to rise, wages won't be keeping up. People will have to make tough decisions, choosing between paying for gas, putting food on the table, or saving for the future. It's not just the consumers who will suffer. The trade war has already taken its toll on the stock market, and major corporations are facing increasing pressure to adjust to a new economic reality. In boardrooms across the country, executives are scrambling to figure out how to protect their bottom line. This uncertainty is driving investors to rethink their positions, and it's making global companies wary of doing business with the US. This is a dangerous game that the US is playing, one where the stakes are high and the consequences are far-reaching. And let's not forget about the political fallout. Politicians in Washington who backed these tariffs are facing growing pressure from both sides. On the one hand, they've angered key industries and voters who depend on those industries for their livelihoods. On the other hand, they're facing growing backlash from the international community. If the US doesn't find a way to back down, it risks becoming increasingly isolated on the world stage. So, what does the future hold? The truth is, no one really knows. The US and Canada are in uncharted territory, and every move they make will have global repercussions. But one thing is for sure, this isn't just a trade war, it's a battle for the future of the global economy. Will the US double down on its aggressive stance? Will Canada continue to push back, forging new alliances that bypass the US? Or will both countries find a way to de-escalate before things spiral out of control? As this trade war continues to unfold, the only certainty is that the world is changing, and the US might not be able to stop it. So, what happens next?
Stay tuned.
The story is far from over.